I am so glad that you are here today. You know, it's good to gather, isn't it? It is good to gather together and to spur one another on. You know, the New Testament actually tells us to don't miss out on that opportunity to do that. And so it's good that you are here. I also know that there are a number of people who are just for whatever reason not able to be here. So I just want to take a minute and just welcome all who are watching online, either Facebook or YouTube or our app or listening to the podcast. I appreciate that you are here. You know, our building is located in Colony, but we are a capital church, and so we are followers of Jesus that are devoted to making Jesus famous throughout the capital region. So wherever you're watching from, throughout the capital region or elsewhere, we actually have regular listeners all over the place. Cool enough. Welcome. Glad that you're here. Glad that you can join us today. The Gospel of John is where we've been looking at, what we've been talking about. The Gospel of John, if you are not familiar, is one of 4 biographies about Jesus that we have collected, and it's a part of the New Testament of the Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And John was written by a guy named John, who was one of Jesus' first ever disciples. He was a teenager when he knew Jesus, and years later he wrote about his eyewitness experiences of living with Jesus for 3 years. And so we're taking these 4 weeks. Last week we started, today's week 2, and we're taking 4 weeks to look at an event that John tells us about, the famous Last Supper of Jesus, the last meal that Jesus spent with his followers, with his closest followers before his crucifixion. And John, he tells us about his experience and his eyewitness of this event. And so as we look at this dinner, this Last Supper of Jesus, we're kind of imagining what it would be for us to be there and to be at that table. And we're learning 4 lessons that Jesus teaches during this supper, 4 courses, if you will, with Jesus. And we are, much of what we're learning has to do with the way Jesus is interacting with the people who are at that table. And there's some very interesting people at that table, some great people at that table. We asked a minute ago if you could have dinner with anyone at all, other than, living or who has ever lived. Who would that be? And we got some interesting answers here. The Blessed Virgin Mary was one that you'd like to have dinner with. C.S. Lewis was another. Michelle Obama also was near the top of the list. Paul the Apostle. Kanye West. I mean, I want to have dinner with Paul the Apostle, C.S. Lewis, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and Kanye West. That right there, that would be a great dinner itself. A lot of great people. Some people to look up to, wide variety of answers, a lot of family members you put in there, answers like that. That's I can see that for sure. Who was the Billy Graham? Who was the first service? Who was the top answer? My mom, actually. It said my mom. I don't know if it was my mom or it was your mom, but it's somebody's mom. Everyone wanted to have dinner with their mom. That's sweet. Anyway, there were a lot of interesting, a lot of great people that we want to look up to, have dinner with. That makes a lot of sense. John tells us that at this table, not only were there a lot of great people, but there was shoulder to shoulder, mixed in right alongside, eating out of the same dishes, there was this guy named Judas. How many have heard of Judas? Now, Judas is a guy that I would not want to have dinner with. Judas is famous. He's famous for failing disastrously. Judas, even if you don't know that name comes out from the Bible, you know what it means to call somebody a Judas. Judas is a backstabber. It's somebody who's a betrayer. Judas is famous for betraying Jesus. Judas is the guy who sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver and literally 30 drachmas, which is really about worth $10. So it really wasn't even about the money. But Judas Judas, he told some kind of crooked cops where Jesus was praying so they could arrest him secretly at night, and they didn't know who he was, and so Judas pointed out who Jesus was by walking up to him and kissing him. And this was Jesus's friend there at that table. Well, you probably know the story. What happened after that? The police, they take Jesus and they bring him to this illegal midnight trial where they run out these set up false accusers, and they try him in front of a kind of a mock jury, a rigged jury, and they sentence him to death, which also was against the law. And they condemned him. Get this, they condemned him for being an enemy of God. That's what Jesus got condemned for. And the next day they brought him and they handed him over to a corrupt Roman government, and the Roman government, they just finished off the injustice. They mocked him, they tortured him. They humiliated him and nailed him to the cross and crucified him. This is Judas. This is why moms don't name their children Judas, right? That's kind of his history. Judas's story is absolutely tragic. Judas's failure is absolutely disastrous, and there is much that we can learn from him. You see, just like Judas, you and I fail. Are we ready to admit that? We all fail. We have failed. We will fail. It's something that we all do. We make mistakes, right? And sometimes, I mean, it's church. Maybe we can be honest. Sometimes they're not really mistakes. Sometimes they're choices, right? Sometimes they're bad choices, and they may be ill-informed choices. We'll say, well, I didn't know. They may be influenced choices. We'll say, well, blame someone else. But at the end of the day, they're decisions that we make. And most of the time that we fail, they're minor things. But maybe you also know what it's like to fail in really big ways. Maybe you know what it's like to fail in a way that has hurt people, hurt a lot of people, maybe even people you love. Maybe you know what it's like to fail God, if that's even on your radar. Maybe you know what it's like to fail yourself in the process. You know your own story, and I won't go through all the ways that we can do that. But here's Judas' story, and here's why Judas' story matters so much and is so important to every single one of us. Because Judas' failure, it wasn't one single bad decision that happened in one moment of bad judgment. Like our failures, Judas' failure was a series of bad steps down a wrong road. And so it's important for us to look, and it's valuable for us to look at his story because just like Judas, you may have failed. You may have even failed terribly. But unlike Judas, you don't have to fail disastrously. And so we're going to look at 5 steps that Judas took toward failing disastrously. And we're going to seek to be able to recognize these things in our own lives so that we can avoid them and avoid going down that same path. Well, here's what John tells us about Jesus and Judas and this Last Supper. He says, just before the Passover festival, Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and to go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Now, last week we talked about what happens right after this is that Jesus, he sets an example for all of his followers. And he wants to teach them, and so he shows them the mindset that would be necessary for them to be influential servant leaders in this world. And so he humbled himself and honored them by washing their feet, Judas's feet included. And then right after that, here's what we read. That Jesus was troubled in his spirit, and he testified, very truly, I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. John tells us his disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which of them he meant. They knew what he meant. They didn't know who he meant. And so here's this moment of this this awkward silence between them, and they're looking at each other, and they're wondering, who is it? Is the betrayer going to admit? Are they going to confess? Are they going to come clean? Is Jesus going to expose whoever it is and point it out? And so we all know. John tells us this. He says, one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Now, John is setting up the scene here. In this day, first century, they didn't have high tables. They were in chairs. This was a low table, and they were on pillows. They were reclining around this table, down on pillows, legs out to the side, like one elbow on the table kind of a thing. So they're all kind of reclining around this table. And in literature, in Hebrew literature of this kind, this genre back then, you wouldn't, if you were in the story, you wouldn't call yourself out as in the story. You would name yourself. And so John, we know that this is John writing this. He's the disciple whom Jesus loved. And when he says this, what he's saying is that kind of the vernacular in our language would be, and Jesus, he loved even me. Like, I'm so blown away that Jesus loved even me. And he's saying, and I was even there. I was there to see this, and I saw this whole thing go down. And so we got this picture. The disciples are around there, and John's there, and he's next to Jesus. And we read that Peter, he motioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." Now, I love picturing this scene here, right? Because you can just imagine how this goes. They're all around there, and Jesus just drops this bombshell, right? And they're stunned. They're silent. Who's the first to speak? It's going to be Peter, of course. But he's way down at the end of the table. And so he's with his brother. Maybe they came in late. I don't know why they're so far away. But they're down there, and Peter and Andrew, and he says, Andrew, hey, ask Jesus. Ask Jesus who it is. And Andrew says, I'm not asking him. You ask him. And Peter's like, no, you ask him. Just ask him. He's like, it's your idea. If you want to know so bad, you ask him. Maybe it's you. It's not me. Ask him. You ask him, right? And so Peter's, he's all frustrated with his brother, and he looks down and he sees John. John's just a teenager, this young guy. He's like, so he motions to John, right? Peter's this big, burly fisherman guy, and he says to John, he says, hey, ask Jesus. John says, what? Ask him who? What? Ask Jesus. Pass the cheeses. There's no cheeses here. What are you talking about? No, ask Jesus. Oh, John gets it. He gets it. So he leans over. He says he leans back against Jesus, and he says, Lord, who is it? Now, no other of the Gospels tell us this next part of the story. So it's more than likely because Jesus answered, he whispered it back to John. Jesus answered, it's the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Now, you got to check this out. So this is a Passover meal. This was a meal. This was a very ceremonious meal. This was a festival meal. There were all kinds of ceremony and ritual and meaning to everything. As the meal went, there were bowls of different kinds of foods, and there was bread here on the table. And so they would go through the meal and go through the ritual, and near the end, there'd be stuff left over. There'd be stuff left over in the bowls and that kind of thing. And so every once in a while, it wasn't necessarily written into the ceremony, but when it called for it, the host of the dinner would take a piece of bread, and he would dip it in to the bowl, and he would like get all the good stuff out. You know, the best, most stuff is it's been, you know, the meat, it's been sauteing in there. He'll get all that out, and he digs it out on the bread, right? You Italians know what I'm talking about, right? And so he would just Jewish style though. So it's like, it's lamb, it's not sausage and sauce and everything. I'm getting hungry. So he digs out the best piece, and instead of eating it, what the host would do is the host would choose one person in that room. One person that he wanted to honor. And he would give this piece, this morsel to that person. And when he was doing that, he was expressing something very powerful. He was saying, I honor you. He was saying, you're special to me. It was an expression of love and of deep friendship. Jesus dips the piece of the bread, and he gives it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. And imagine that moment, right? Imagine that moment if you're Judas and you receive that bread. What would that do for you, that expression of love? I mean, wouldn't that do something to you? Wouldn't that impact? Wouldn't that maybe you think, change your mind? Wouldn't that do something? What do you do with that expression of love? Well, here's what Judas does. It says that as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered him. Judas received the bread, but he rejected the expression of love from Jesus. Instead of that softening his heart, it hardened his heart. And Jesus said, what you're about to do quickly. And verse 30 tells us that as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. 5 steps. 5 steps to failing disastrously from the story of Judas. Number 1 is this: make your own plan without asking what his plan is. Okay? So here's the first step to failing disastrously. Make your own plan without asking God what his plan is. Something that the gospel writers are kind of, they're not explicit on is Judas's motive here. Why did he do this? Satan is given influential credit to the whole thing, but by far, the vast majority of scholars, they tell us that it was not the gospel writer's intention to ever make us think that Judas was possessed, demon-possessed, like in the way that we would think about it. Rather, as we read through the Gospels, you see that all of the writers, they talk about Judas like he was a villain who did villainous things. Not a victim who was acting against his will, but he was making these choices. Scholars suggest here's what he was doing. 2 possibilities. One is this, and these kind of come from understanding the text and the way that they refer to Judas. The word Iscariot, Judas Iscariot, kind of like his last name, it could also mean Judas of the Sicarii. The Sicarii were an offshoot group of another group called the Zealots. The Sicarii were a more violent, a more radical group of zealots. They were named for a knife, a small knife that they would carry called the Sicarii. They could hide that in their cloak, and they would use that for assassinations. If you were Israeli, you considered the Sicarii freedom fighters. If you were Roman, you called them terrorists. And so Judas was a part of this Sicarii. It's possible that Judas saw Jesus and thought, hey, this is the military political conqueror that we've been looking for. The Sicarii wanted nothing more at all than to stir up a revolution and to overthrow Rome. And so they were enemies of Rome and everyone who sympathized with Rome. So maybe Judas saw Jesus as this military political conqueror who was going to spark this revolution that Judas had dreamed about. But Jesus was dragging his feet. So some scholars think that maybe what Judas was doing here is he was trying to force the action. He was trying to force, if he could create a conflict between Jesus and the authorities, then Jesus would have to act. Then he'd have to use his messianic power and to start this revolution. It's possible that Judas didn't know who Jesus was that off about who Jesus was and why Jesus was here. There's another thought related to that, and that's that maybe finally it occurred to Judas that was not who Jesus was. That Jesus was not going to be a military, political conqueror who was going to do what Judas wanted him to do. That Jesus was not going to use weapons of privilege and force to accomplish the things that Judas wanted him to accomplish. Maybe it was that Judas understood finally that Jesus' agenda was so very different from his. And when he saw that, when he discovered that, maybe it was out of anger and disappointment. Maybe even feeling betrayed because Jesus wasn't who he wanted him to be. That Judas sided with Jesus' enemies. Whichever it was, what's clear is this: Judas had made his own plans, and he had not asked Jesus about his. And when he found out how different Jesus' plans were than his, he tried to force his plans anyway. And he resorted to trying to eliminate Jesus altogether. Did you ever do that? I mean, if you're like me, you probably plan stuff out, right? You probably have a plan. If you're like me, you've probably got a plan for everything, right? You got a plan for your life. You got a plan for your career. You got a plan for your family. You got a plan for your kids, right? They don't know it yet, but you've got a plan for them. You've got a plan for your church. You got a plan for everything. It's good. It's good to plan. Have you asked God what his plan is? Do you want to know? I mean, is it your plan to do his plan? Or are you so invested in your own plans that it really doesn't matter what his plans are? Making your own plan without asking God what his is, it is setting yourself up for failure in the immediate. But it's worse than that. It's also taking a step toward failing disastrously in the long term. Number 2, resent correction. Just before this Last Supper, we are told about another dinner given in honor of Jesus, where it happens at Mary's house, not Mary, the Blessed Mother, the Blessed Virgin Mary, the mother, but a different Mary. He is there at her house, and she breaks open this vial of uber expensive perfume. Like as much as you make an entire year, that's how expensive this perfume is. And she breaks it open and she pours it on Jesus as an expression of how valuable he is to her. Well, Jesus sees this, and he sees all kinds of how profound and beautiful and significant it is. He sees himself in it, right? He sees the way that he is also going to be broken open and poured out to express how valuable humanity is to him. Judas doesn't see any of this. In fact, we're told that Judas, he sees this and he rebukes the woman, and he says, he calls it a waste. He says, what a waste. Well, as soon as he comes at her like this, Jesus immediately rebukes him. And he corrects Judas. And he calls out Judas for being insincere in his motives. And for having his priorities all messed up. And he makes clear again that he has come to go to the cross, not to be some conquering hero. And in contrast to what Judas said about her action being a waste, he actually elevates and honors Mary and says, actually, what you've done is going to make you unforgettable. Well, we're told that as soon as Jesus says this, as soon as he corrects Judas like that, immediately, then Judas went to the chief priests to betray him to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. We make our own plans without asking God what his plans are. We're bound to run into correction. You know what I mean? But God's correction is not to shame us. God's correction is to redirect us, to put us back on the right track he has in mind for us. How do you respond to correction? That's an important question, isn't it? We have the disciple Peter, and if you look at his story, that guy is getting corrected nonstop by Jesus, right? But in Peter's situation, it drew him closer to Jesus, and he grew because of it. Judas, when he's corrected, he resents it, and he seeks to eliminate Jesus from the conversation. How do you respond to correction? How do you respond when you're reading the Bible and you come across some area that is correcting the way that you think or the way you've been living? What about in a sermon? What about with a spiritual leader? Do you resent it? I mean, I'm not asking, do you do it? Do you obey dutifully? I'm saying, do you resent it? You see, when you resent correction, a sure sign of you resenting correction is that you kind of subtly watch for opportunities to remove that correcting voice from the conversation. It's subtle. We do it almost involuntarily. We read something in the Bible, we don't like it because it corrects us, so we're just not going to read that section of the Bible anymore. Or we're just not going to read the Bible anymore. We're just going to prefer to kind of stick with, some Christian authors who already agree with the way I see things. Or we're just not going to go back to that church. Or we're just not going to go back to that community group or talk to that person because we don't want to be challenged in any way. Look, being corrected is never fun. It means we messed up, and nobody wants to mess up. And nobody wants to be told that we're wrong. But failing happens, right? Let's just be honest, failing happens. So correction is necessary. How do you respond to it? Insisting on our own rightness? Seeking to eliminate any correcting voice from the conversation? These are signs that we resent correction. And they're another step towards failing disastrously. How y'all doing? You having fun? You still with me? Number 3, the number 3 step towards failing disastrously. Reject the undeserved love of Jesus. Will you imagine going through what was going through Judas's mind when Jesus is washing his feet? He knows where he's just been. Imagine what's going through Judas's mind when he hands him that piece of bread, knowing that Jesus knows everything and yet loves him anyway. I mean, what would you do in the face of this unconditional, irrational, undeserved love of Jesus? Wouldn't that change something within you? Judas's heart is hardened. Matthew tells us about the moment when Judas fulfills this betrayal. He says, now then the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man, arrest him. So going at once to Jesus, Judas said, greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. And Jesus replied, do what you came for, friend. What's going through Judas's mind when Jesus in that moment even refers to him as his friend? What do you do with that kind of love? That's actually the question of Christianity. I mean, that's the question for you to answer here in this. If you answer no other question, that's the one to answer here today. The true message of Christianity is this, that Jesus knows everything about you. He knows the absolute worst of you. He knows those darkest secrets that no one else knows. He knows those things about you that you don't even want to admit. He already knows it. He knows about all of the terrible failures of your past. He knows about all the things that are in your mind to do even now. He knows all of the ways that you're going to fail in the future. And knowing all of that, he loves you. He loves you unconditionally. He loves you. The gospel is this. It's good news for those who see themselves in Judas. The gospel is good news who see Judas in themselves. Because Jesus is for failures. It's good news for all of those who will look at Jesus and see the love of God and say, I want that. What will you do with that kind of love? Every person has the freedom to reject that love. There are two mindsets that will lead to rejecting the undeserved love of God. One is this, to be delusional about your own goodness and imagine that you earn or you deserve God's love more than some other kind of sinner. Jesus actually talks about this kind of mindset. And he says, if you think that you deserve God's love more than some other kind of sinner, that no matter what you think, you are actually not even close. You are far from being right with God. The other mindset that keeps us from really receiving that undeserved love of God is to know that we are undeserving, but to pridefully refuse to accept what you have not earned. Rejecting God's undeserved love for you, it's another step toward failing disastrously. Number 4, isolate yourself. Get this. John tells us that Judas got up from the table and then just went out into the darkness by himself. And nobody questioned it. In fact, the other 3 Gospels, they don't even mention Judas leaving the room. It's like, I don't know, Judas was at the table, and the next thing I know, he shows up with this mob. I mean, I don't even know who he is. You know those people in high school when they sit like up in the front of the room, and it's not until Friday that you notice that they've been absent all week? That's like Judas, right? Judas is, and think about this, even before that, right? Even before this night, Judas somehow, in between this dinner at Mary's house and this dinner here, he somehow got away from the group and made these nefarious plans with the religious leaders without anyone suspecting anything. Meaning what? Meaning Judas was a part of the 12, but he had isolated himself. He had separated himself from the community to where people didn't even know where he was. And listen, being isolated, he opened himself to another voice. Here's what John tells us. The devil had already prompted Judas. Here's what Luke says. Then Satan entered Judas, and he discussed how he might betray Jesus. Isolation, we might say, is where the devil enters into the conversation. Look, I have said it again and again. I will continue to say it until every single one of you are in a community group or a serve team or both. Isolation is not only unfruitful, like you won't bear any fruit, you won't make any difference, it's also dangerous. Isolation is not only unfruitful, it's dangerous. I see it all of the time. Apart from the community, you are divided and you will be conquered. In your private life, in your thoughts. You know those thoughts? Nobody likes me. Nobody appreciates me. Nobody cares. You don't fit in at that church. You should go somewhere else. Those are all coming from the one person who doesn't want you in church. The New Testament describes the church as a body, right? Many parts all fitting together as one. I think we could say then, if we want to get a visual image, a Christian who isolates himself or herself is kind of like a severed hand that washes up on the Jersey Shore, right? It's lifeless, it's purposeless, and it's not as uncommon as it should be, right? Satan targets isolated believers who are detached from the body. God knows this. It's why he gave us one another. It's why he gave us the church. James says, look, hey, if you know people who have wandered off from God's truth, don't write them off. Go after them. Get them back. But the church, community, just like everything else that God gives us, it can be rejected. When we isolate ourselves, we take another huge step towards failing disastrously. Number 5, give up too soon. Matthew tells us about the disastrous end, the disastrous failure of Judas. It says, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse. And he returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. I have sinned, he said, for I have betrayed innocent blood. What is that to us, they replied. That's your responsibility. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. You know, there's a lot of tough parts of the Bible. There's a lot of sad parts. I think this maybe bothers me more than any other one. Because it's not only terrible, there's no redemption in it. There's very few stories in the Bible where there isn't some good that rises out. But there's no redemption in this. It's just completely disastrous. And worst of all, it's completely unnecessary. Because in just 3 days, Jesus was going to rise from the dead. And I don't know for sure, but I believe with all of my heart that Judas would have been the first person that Jesus went to. And I say that because, if you were to make a list of Jesus' lousy friends, right? Judas is number one, right? But Peter's right there, number two. I mean, Peter on that very same night denied even knowing Jesus, let alone, and just to save his own skin, let alone affiliating with him. But what is on Jesus' mind as soon as he comes out of the tomb? Hey, let Peter know. He tells the woman, hey, let Peter know that I'm alive. And he changed Peter's story. I believe he would have done the same for Judas. But Judas gave up too soon. I mean, look, I get it. No one expected the resurrection. Not even the best of Jesus' followers. No one expected Jesus to do or God to do something that he had never done before. So I get it. But what if? Man, what if Judas had not given up? What if he had held on? What if he had waited for Jesus? What if he had waited for Jesus? How might his story have been changed? Look, this right here is where failing turns into failing disastrously. And this may be the message for you today. This may be the reason that you're here today, the reason that you're listening. Because maybe you're thinking about giving up. Maybe you're ready to give up on your dream. Maybe you're ready to give up on your marriage. Maybe you're ready to give up on your church, on your calling. Maybe you're ready to give up on your kids. I don't know. Maybe you're ready to give up on life. Don't do it. Don't do it. The resurrection could be coming in your life any minute. It could just be days away, and your whole story will be changed. Listen, sometimes the most difficult thing, but the most spiritual thing that you'll ever do is just hold on. Maybe the greatest act of faith sometimes that you will ever have is just wait for Jesus. Just hold on. You may have failed. You may have failed disastrously. But you may have failed terribly, but you don't have to fail disastrously. You have not gone too far to be brought back. You cannot go too far to be forgiven, to be healed, to be restored, to find freedom. You may have failed, even terribly, but you don't have to fail disastrously. One of the coolest things about Albany is we're like in the intersection of the Northeast, right? Like you can take 87 north and go up to Montreal. You can take 87 south and go down to New York. You can take 90 west and go out to Buffalo, and 90 east and go to Boston. And we're kind of like right there. And next to that intersection is like just down the street from us right here, right? And when I go home, I go 87 south and then 90 east, and that takes me over to Albany. But sometime, what if I'm going and I miss that? If I miss that 90 east, right? I miss that off. I end up on 87 south, which is okay because 87 south is still going in the direction of my home. I mean, it's going to cost me something now because I'm going to have to pay a toll because 87 south to 90 east, that's toll free. Now, if I miss that exit, then I'm going to have to pay a toll. So it's going to cost me something, but it's okay. I just got one exit. I'll just get off that next exit, and I'll get to where I need to be. But imagine like I'm riding and my wife's in the car with me, and she asked me, "Why'd you go this way?" Right? Why'd you go this way? Instead of just saying like, "Oh, I made a mistake. I missed that turn." Instead, I start to defend myself. Right? Start to say crazy things like, "Well, I've always thought we should pay tolls anyway. I really prefer paying tolls. I want to I'm only taking toll roads from now on." And while I'm defending myself with how right I am, even though imagine I blow by that exit. I blow by exit 23. Now, what am I going to do? Now, there's only one smart thing for me to do, right? Get off the next exit. Now, it's going to cost me more now because I missed another. It's going to cost me more to get off that next exit. It's going to cost me more to get back on the right track. But what's the alternative? Keep going? The longer I go down that wrong road, the more it's going to cost me. The more it's going to cost me to get off that wrong road, the more it's going to cost me to get back onto the right road. And that wrong road's not going to loop around. If I stay on 87 South, it's not coming back around to my home, to where I need to be. I mean, think about it. If I stay on that road, if I just, I'm just going to keep going, I'm right, I'm just going to keep going down 87 South, then I'm likely to run into 95 South. And if I stay on 95 South and I keep going, lead me right into the fires of Florida. And that's a disastrous failure. I would never want to do. You get my point, right? In your life, in your relationships, you may fail. You may find yourself on the wrong road. Get off the exit. Don't keep going down the same road. Yeah, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you to get off that road, to get off that exit. It's going to cost you to get back on it. It's only going to cost you more. The longer you keep going, it's going to cost you more. Get off that exit. Turn around. Get back on that right road. You may have failed, but you don't have to fail disastrously. Real quick, here are 5 exits you can take to get off that path of failing disastrously. Ready? I'm going to go super quick. 5 exits you can take to get off. Number 1, receive the undeserved love of Jesus. That's how you step into a relationship with Jesus. That's how your identity is changed. That changes everything. Receive that undeserved love of Jesus. Number 2, seek God's leadership in your life. Hit that next slide. Trust in the Lord. The wise Solomon said, with all your heart, do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you the path to take. Make your plan to do his plan. It's the key to success. Number 3, stay open to redirection. Look, read all of the Bible. Come to all of the church. Get into spiritual coaching. Invite spiritual leaders to speak into your life. Don't look for people who agree with you. Look for people who agree with God. And fill your life with them. Number 4, share life. Join a community group. Join a serve team. Find life through connection. Share life with others. Don't try to do it alone. And number 5, never give up. Please, never give up. You may have failed. You may have failed terribly. But you don't have to fail disastrously. The gospel's this: Jesus is for failures. Jesus knows all about it. He knows about your failures, and he's not against you because of it. He's for you. He's on your side. He loves you, and he gave his life to give you hope that your story can change. And he invites you to receive his undeserved love. And listen, you'll never really be able to experience that love until you do 2 things. Until you turn to Jesus and trust in him. You turn to Jesus when you say, Jesus, I admit it. I've failed. I do fail. I will fail. Because it's not just mistakes. There's something broken. Something broken inside of me, and I need to be saved. I need to be rescued. I need to be healed. I need to be led. That's turning to Jesus. And when you do that, then trust in him and say, and Jesus, I trust that you are the one to rescue me. I trust that you can heal me. I trust that you can lead me. And so I give my life to you, and I invite you into my life. And Scripture says this, when you do that, your identity changes. You go from failure to child of God. God gives you His Spirit to enable you to live the life of purpose that He has in mind for you. And all of your failures are forgiven. This morning, if you say, I want that, you can have that today. I want to give you an opportunity to do that. But that's a personal decision. So I would ask if everyone would bow your heads and close your eyes. I just want to ask you, just take a moment right now where you are. You say, I want that undeserved love of God. I admit that I have failed and that I do fail and that I will fail. I turn to Jesus and I trust Him. I trust that He's the one that can save me and forgive me and heal me and lead me. This morning, if you want to give your life to Jesus, invite Him into your life, just raise your hand and I want to pray for you. I'm not going to ask you to stand up. Yes, yes. I'm not going to ask you to come forward. Yes, yes. I just want to pray with you. Yes, yes. So I want to give my life to Jesus. I want to receive His love. I turn to Him. I admit I'm broken. Yes. And I know that He's the one that can rescue me. Anyone else? Yes. Yes. You can put your hands down. I'm going to ask you to pray with me. And you just repeat after me and you pray with me. And God is responding to your response to Him. And if you are a follower of Jesus this morning, I would ask you to also pray with us so no one prays alone. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for your love for me. Even though you know me, all of my failures, you love me. You call me your friend. I believe in you. I trust you to save me, to heal me. I invite you to lead me. I ask you to help me to get off the wrong roads, get on the right track. Make your plan my plan. I pray this in your name. Amen.